welcome. This is Canonical, the podcast that takes literature out of the classroom. I'm James Shao, and with me are my co-hosts Iad Darris and Sam Spieler.
Hello.
Yo.
Hello. Today we are continuing our discussion of Viet Nguyen's The Sympathizer, the second book in our series, Rich Country, Poor Country. Our discussion today may contain spoilers. If you haven't read the book, you can listen to our spoiler-free review episode, which was published last week. If you'd like to chat with us, you can find us on social media or on Reddit at CanonicalPod.
So, I wanted to start briefly with a softball question first. I love the title of this book. It's one of those titles that I think has significance throughout the novel.
You should have started with an actual softball question.
I should have.
Why do pitchers pitch underhand in softball?
A sympathizer is a person who agrees with or supports a sentiment or opinion, but I think it's actually more broad than that too. The sympathy aspect may simply mean someone who shares another's shame or guilt. This novel is constantly fighting against definitions. The narrator struggles with reconciling his race, birth, home, allegiance, philosophy, desires, morality, and as a subsection to some of these things, action versus inaction. Are there other characters that stand out to you as struggling with these things as well?
I think in terms of action and inaction, what I enjoyed most in the novel was the way that the general and Bond deal with escaping Vietnam. The tension for the general that I see is that he wants to continue being a leader in his community, and he wants to demand sacrifice and respect from other people. But it's very clear, because he's there with them in America, that he hasn't sacrificed himself. So that's a big tension for him. But for Bon, I think it's different. I think it's more like survivor's guilt, where he can't reconcile the fact that he continues to live when his family has died, and his family are totally innocent in terms of the war, whereas he is like this kind of elite ranger sniper type of guy. He's very involved. So he is very eager to die in combat in order to reconcile the situation, in order to make things seem right to him.
Do you think the general stands for a lot of actual people, or is that, do you think, a pretty small subsection of immigrants from the war?
I'm only speculating here because I'm not obviously part of this community, but it's like you had a certain social position in Vietnam, and then you take yourself out of that context and you move to a new context where there are new parameters and a new social hierarchy. How do you deal with your new position? So I think that's what's going on with his character. In terms of there being lots of people like him, I couldn't really say, but I would imagine, yes, there are some.
I think there must be a big group of Vietnamese refugees after the war who were quite well-to-do or in positions of power, because these were the people, as the book details, the people who were able to leave. You know, you could only leave if you were well-connected. If you weren't well-connected, you're a boat person. You left via raft or something on the way to Hong Kong or Thailand. I think quite a few refugees who were able to actually leave via plane were at least connected to the government in some way. So much so that it's almost a trope. In American culture, there's this trope of the immigrant who's just like, yeah, back in my home country, I was a doctor or whatever. Like, you see it as a throwaway joke in a lot of sitcoms.
Mm-hmm.
The general, one of the things he struggles with is trying to command respect, even though, at the end of the novel, he is not acting as a general. He's trying to, but he is the owner of a liquor store, and his wife runs a restaurant. That seems like a big issue for him and for people of this type, that struggling to maintain respect when they're not leading anything anymore. I think that's one of the reasons why he, other than believing in his cause and wanting his Vietnam back, it seems like he's lost something that he's never going to have again, and he's struggling to maintain that.
I think that tension is quite clear, and you can see it in his relationship with his daughter, who has become very Americanized. And at the end, he's trying to control what she can and can't do and who she can see and who she can't date. I think you can see that as kind of a manifestation of his loss of control, that he's gradually losing more and more power the longer he stays in the US. Not just his position as a general, but his position as like the head of a Vietnamese family.
I think that's true, but while he doesn't have the same formal position of power that he had in Vietnam, he does build up towards having a position of power in the US. He is still a leader of his community. He still does speak to the congressman on behalf of his community. He still does organize this group of people to go back to the country, and they take directions from him in terms of military operation. But that kind of power that he has when he's in America is something that has to be negotiated. It's not taken as a given. And that to me, I thought was interesting, is this period where he loses the power that he can count on. And then it just becomes kind of the force of his personality, where because he has this kind of personality and he acts and he carries himself the way he does, he naturally kind of rises to the occasion. Like he still gets this guy to drive him around and call him general and be his lackey, even though he's not getting a salary anymore. He's not part of the military anymore. He still does these things for him.
So, this is actually, I think, one of the few understated parts of the novel because so much of it is explicit. His decision to send the protagonist away because the protagonist was dating his daughter actually does have consequences, because the protagonist and Bon are the ones who actually do all his dirty work, right? And he's the only guy who listens to him, and he's the guy who goes to these meetings with them and charms the foreigners because he's very well read. Like, he essentially is sending away the remnants of his power, I think, because he's deciding it is more important to me that I control my daughter or have this sense of power over my family and the social standing that comes from that, than to actually have my right-hand man who literally does everything for me that's important. And he's deciding to sacrifice that. I think that's a very interesting part of the book.
I do too, but I don't know that this character has really thought that far ahead.
Yeah, I don't think he's making this as a conscious choice, but I think the writer, like I said, is very understated. It's one of the few few parts of this book where you have to unpack it. You're like, oh, this is the consequence of this decision.
The decision at the end to send this group of what turns out to be ragtag group of soldiers back to Vietnam makes me wonder if there were a lot of such things that happened at the end of the war. It felt a little bit to me like the Bay of Pigs in Cuba, where they have this idea that sounds okay on paper, and then once you actually throw it out there, it's a disaster. Like once they get to Vietnam again, I don't know what they were expecting, but it doesn't seem like there's going to be very much success. So it makes me wonder if there were a lot of such things, sponsored by the CIA or whoever.
Nguyen in interviews has said that there were some. I don't know if it happened frequently, and if it did happen frequently, at least with CIA backing, I doubt that anybody involved would be free to talk about it. But I would imagine that at least immediately after, there were a lot of people who were very interested in doing the same thing.
Including some higher up American soldiers, because I actually knew a major in the army who served in Vietnam who remained convinced, even in the 2000s, that the US made a huge mistake by pulling out. Like, he was there over the entirety of the war, I think, first as an advisor, right, and then as an actual military leader. And he was absolutely convinced that the US fucked up and that they needed to immediately respond with more force, not less force. He's one of those, the weakness at home caused us to lose the war people.
I was going to ask how you see Sophia Mori in this as well, fighting against definitions.
Well, you're talking about Lana, the general's daughter, earlier, being very Americanized. Like, where does Sophia Mori stand on this paradigm of Americanization that Lana seems to be on perhaps the bottom of?
Mori just wants to be American without having to prove her Japaneseness. And I think her boss constantly wants her to use her Japanese heritage more. When she was born in, I forget where, it says, I think Crenshaw or somewhere in Southern California. So she's as American as anyone, but she's struggling with that, not just for that reason, but she also lived through the internment camps. So she's got this strong desire to be taken seriously as an American citizen, but also she has this, it's stronger than disappointment, but I get the sense that's always in her memory, that this is something that the US can take from you at any time. You have to make it known that you are an American. You have to constantly prove yourself as an American, or it's going to be taken from you.
I have the feeling that this is probably an overstatement, but in some ways, the Lanas of the world become the Sophias of the world. As people become more and more ingrained in the American life that they find themselves situated in, they become more and more disconnected from their ancestral life. And that, to me, I don't think is a problem, but it is a problem for people like the general and for people like the department chair who see biology as destiny. They see your ancestry as very determining of what kind of person you are and what kind of life you should have.
They're also coming from it at a slightly different perspective, though, too, right? That Sophia was not directly involved in the war, in World War II. She did go through the internment camps, like I said, but she is not an immigrant the way Lana is. I think you're right that I can see the Lanas becoming more of the Sophia Moris, but I think we see that a lot too in how she keeps telling the narrator not to call her Miss Mori. And I think in some ways you can say that that is because that is overly formal, but Sophia is not a Japanese name. I feel like that is done very intentionally, that kind of putting distance between those two names, correcting him that her name is Sophia, not Miss Mori.
I mean, how do you think this plays against the narrator being half French, half Vietnamese? Because at several points in the novel, people treat him poorly and they call him unnatural, specifically because of that fact. So it seems like this kind of emphasis that the department chair is putting on people and their ancestry is of a piece or ideologically similar to calling people unnatural for being mixed race. Are these two things meant to play off of each other? Is this something that the author is trying to bring your attention to? Because that's where I come to it, is that when you judge people according to how well they perform their ethnicity, then somebody being mixed race is essentially, it's a handicap. It's preventing them from performing their race correctly in terms of the eyes of people like the department head.
Yeah, I think he's drawing that link for us. I wonder if the narrator is consciously or unconsciously doing the same thing to Miss Mori or to Sophia by calling her that. I was trying to figure out, not rhetorically, but why in the story he constantly calls her Miss Mori. Like, it feels like a very rhetorical thing to do, that it's more of a writer thing rather than something an actual character would do. I mean, he's sleeping with her. Why is he still this formal after so long?
I think it could be something to do with the kind of unreality of his life in America and the people that he meets in America. They don't strike him in the same way as the things that he encounters in Vietnam do, because he is taken very suddenly out of the situation where he belongs to a certain structure of power and he's thrown very violently into another structure. It's difficult for him to shift from being who he is in Vietnam to who he is in America.
I guess this also goes along with what he tells the department head about the respectfulness that comes with his Asian heritage rather than I forget what the opposite of that is that he gives in that list. The American side, the Western side. But I know that there is an opposite, the informality.
I think one question to consider is whether or not he views the two women differently and whether they differ in importance to him, because I feel like they do, in that he is attracted to Sophia, but I think he actually cares for Lana much more. And the question is, well, why? Why is it that for Sophia, really he only cares insofar that he's been rejected? Like he doesn't seem to have a connection or want a connection with her. And what is it about Lana, besides her being potentially more attractive? Like setting that aside, what is it about Lana being this Vietnamese person who's become Americanized that seems attractive to him? Is it more than that? Is it more than this symbol of becoming American? Is that what he loves and then leaves behind? Like, is it more than just that kind of surface symbolism?
I don't know, but it's interesting to me that he fantasizes about Lana to the extent that even though he fights against it, he pictures her in that Ao Dai.
And I Googled it. It is very fetching.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know what he's talking about.
Yeah.
All right, Mr. Creep.
Anyway, there's like a thin, form-fitting formal dress for all East Asian countries, it seems like. Anyway, going away from your topic of choice to why he is drawn to her, I think, thinking about that might be illustrative in some way. There's something that she represents that Sophia doesn't represent, which is what he's attracted to.
I think what she represents is that she has it all. Like she has the connection to the past and to the future. And I think that that connection is illusory. I don't think it's possible to have your foot in both worlds and maintain fully in both worlds.
I actually didn't see her that way. I saw her as someone firmly Americanized and who's severing her connection to the past.
Well, I think that we kind of see a little bit of that when he has that conversation with her toward the end before he leaves. I think part of that gets shattered for him because she's sympathetic, but it seems like she just wants to sleep with him. And he also wants to sleep with her too, but I don't know if they're fully connecting on that larger sense that you're talking about, that foot in both worlds. Like she's fully committed to the American side.
Despite who she really is, I think what matters is that he is, even though he's very kind of sardonic and knowing, he is a very nostalgic narrator. He does care a lot about the past. And the scene where he kind of falls in love with her is at this nightclub where she's singing all of these old Vietnamese songs that remind him of the past. Like, I think that maybe despite himself, he can't help but remember all of the things from his time in Saigon very fondly. And that to me, I think is quite significant. Whether or not that's how she sees herself, that's how he sees her.
I think another way of looking at this dynamic of him and Sophia and Lana is that Sophia kind of intellectualizes the problem, whereas Lana is like all feeling. And that's another way of kind of understanding perhaps what he wants or needs. Because this book is so intellectual, but it's a rejection of Sophia, right? Of this kind of intellectual attitude toward race.
I mean, just me as a reader, if I had the option of hanging out with Lana or hanging out with Sunny and Miss Mori, definitely choose Lana.
Because of the age difference, is that what you mean?
Sunny and Miss Mori, they just seem so uptight. Like, there's no fun.
There's also, like, the last way I would look at it is one offers the potential for something more in the future and one doesn't. Sophia is quite clear that she is not interested in him in that way, whereas with Lana, who knows? I mean, her parents certainly take it very seriously.
If he is with Lana and they have children and they have life together, he can take a step closer to being 100% Vietnamese, which may be something that he wants. But if he's with Miss Mori, whatever it is that he nostalgically remembers about Vietnam is just going to be further and further diluted.
I'm going to change gears here. I want to talk about what I think is one of the most important things to this novel is this parallel sense that Nguyen uses. He likes to balance one idea against another, where you've got one piece of the novel that mirrors or is sort of symmetrical to another piece. So one of those images for me is catechism versus interrogation. Another is film or observation versus reality and involvement. And with that, I'm thinking of battle scenes, the interrogation scenes, the rape scenes, and also Richard Head,
Dickhead.
and the department chair versus the commandant and the commissar. Are there other examples of this, and how important was this idea of parallelism to you?
I think it's the way he structures the book, right? So it provides a kind of continuity in a book that, as we mentioned in the review, goes from one place to another and can feel scattered. But this kind of structure, I think, is something that underpins the book.
Yeah, that's true in terms of craft, but does this pairing of things have a rhetorical purpose? Does it help him to make any points?
For me, this is like the main point of the book is the duality. Like for me, this is what the book is about. He is a divided person. The country is divided. His experience and loyalties are divided. Literally, experiences are divided by Vietnam and then the US and then back in Vietnam. This is what the book is about for me. I guess you can tell from my tone, it seems like that's the point. If you're saying this is not important, you're kind of saying like, well, the book isn't important. For me, this is the book. The book is the exploration of this division or duality.
The reason why I ask what the point is because I think that you're right, that he wants to show his divided character. And I think that it's clear to me that that's what his intention is, but I don't know if it's successful because I think while there are things that are paired, it's clear to me what the author's point of view is and also what the character's point of view is. It's never him vacillating between two options. It's always him seeing things in pairs, but knowing what he wants. And that to me, I think, is an issue intellectually because this is a novel of ideas and it has import, or the stakes of the novel to me are where the novelist and the character land in terms of these big questions, especially at the end of the novel. That to me, I see as kind of the narrative arc of the novel. And for me, the issue that I have is he seems to feel one way at the beginning and pretty much the same way at the end. So I would have liked it to be more problematized.
I want to probe that a little bit because I don't know that I agree. I feel like he is constantly struggling.
Yeah, I would put it even much stronger terms than I don't know if I would agree. I disagree. I think throughout the book he's quite indecisive. Like even with the evacuation of Saigon, he is really on the fence about whether or not he should leave. And the return, he's on the fence about whether or not he should go back because his loyalties are split. With his relationship with Sophia, I mean, he's not decisive at all. With Lana, it's a little bit more clear. That's why this kind of pairing I think is interesting because he obviously favors one over the other. But I think throughout the book, when given a choice, he rarely favors one over the other. He seems to be quite indecisive throughout the book. Like when he's asked to kill the fat major, he's indecisive. He doesn't know if he should do it.
Right.
It seems like every step of the way, the tension is whether or not he should do it. And the tension arises from the fact that he's a divided person.
Well, even when he kills Sonny because he's annoyed. He doesn't kill Sonny because he wants to kill Sonny for the general's purposes. It's like a heat of the moment kind of thing, even though he's there to do that.
I think it depends on how you conceptualize indecision. Because yes, he is troubled by the things that he does, but I don't know if that trouble is him wrestling with the ideas versus him just not wanting to do something and then doing it And then at the end, oh, I wish I didn't have to do that. It seems to me clear that he didn't want to kill the crapulent major, but he has to do it. And then at the end, he regrets doing it and he's haunted by it. And he didn't want to kill Sonny, but he had to do it. And then after he did it, he's troubled by it. So it's not wrestling between ideas, it's wrestling with the power of the world that he lives in. And that, I suppose, is compelling, but I would be much more intrigued with him kind of wrestling with the ideas. Here, I think specifically the idea that I want him to wrestle with is the value of communism.
Well, this is going to lead me to my last question, because I want to talk about this character kind of in general and what he represents. At the end of the novel, the narrator has this epiphany. He's got this kind of dissolution of self and the realization that he is nothing. And I think that means even more than the meaning that he offers in the book. For example, the character is never named. What effect does that have? What does it mean that this character doesn't have a name?
It's written in the tradition of books like Ellison's Invisible Man, where I think it's also unnamed in that book.
And he's talked about Ellison as being a big influence.
His son is named Ellison.
So I think that's one part of it. It's kind of a callback, just like how, the squid is a reference to Portnoy's complaint. Same. But the other effect that Ellison also uses is that this stands in both for every person, right? Every Vietnamese person in this book, every Black person in that book who is going through the same experience, but also stands for how the Black person in Ellison's case was invisible or obliterated, and how the Vietnamese is overlooked in American history as well.
Do you see this kind of employment elsewhere in the book? Do you see an erasure of sorts or a kind of a stand-in?
Yes, kind of, because he plays around with names, right? Like the commandant, the commissar, and like the general, for example, it's just the general. And we talked about Dickhead earlier, and Miss Maury and Sophia. So when you're talking about names, yeah, he tries to make a name mean not what a name usually means, which is a specific person who has a specific kind of life experience. He usually makes it a title or a function.
I think this goes back to our discussion that we had with Drive My Car. This is a very structuralist move. He is denying personal specificity. These are points within a system. They don't inhabit personal space, but they inhabit a space where they fulfill a role within a structure. And certain characters have personal names, and I think it's quite distinct when they do, people like Sonny and Lana. But for a lot of the characters, they have very broad personal names that refer only to the role that they fulfill in the structure, and it shows that their personal perspective is less valuable. And I'm not sure whether this is Nguyen's intention or not, but it seems to have some political implications in terms of where he ends up politically at the end of the novel, which I think I'll talk more about in the next episode next week.
Yeah, I think a lot of these characters are stripped of actual identities because they stand in for something larger. They stand in for larger concepts. Like, for example, the director of the film is just called the auteur. He's not given a name, and you can take that as meaning that it's supposed to be this sly move that Nguyen is doing, that he doesn't want to name the director by name, especially if this is supposed to be a real film or is related to a real film. But I think really what he's doing is leveling a complaint at all of Hollywood with that specifically. Or in the case of his fellow army personnel, he's kind of giving us character types, archetypes, rather than specific people. Like the general is a certain type, the crapulent major is a certain type, the grizzled captain is a certain type, rather than, say, Sunny or Sophia or Lana are more, they do stand for certain types of people, but they're also more individualized.
What about the first part of your question about him being nothing? You said that it has more meaning than the meaning he offers. What is that extra meaning?
Well, James already kind of covered it, that he is a stand-in for all of Vietnamese people, all refugees. That he as a character is not really an individual. That at the end of the novel, his mind is kind of shattered in that he starts referring to himself as we. He's of two different minds, but when he uses the first person plural, it makes it even more concrete that he's talking about something bigger than just himself. That he is a stand-in for a people rather than just a singular character.
All right, we'll stop here. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to let us know what you thought about this episode, you can find us on Reddit or on social media at CanonicalPod. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can give us a review on Apple or your podcast platform of choice. Next week, we'll be back with another in-depth discussion of the Sympathizer. Till then, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.